Good evening. My name is James Pridemore. I'm a junior as a transfer student here at Northern Michigan University. Tonight, we're going to discuss how a couple of different disciplines are related to environmental science and how they relate to what I'm studying. So, three disciplines we're going to look at are political science, economics, and history. Now, political science we're going to start with because it's relatively easy, although there are some deeper connections that we have to make. We all know that environmental science plays a role in our governmental processes. For example, one of the more interesting tax credits being done away with in the 2017 House Tax Reform Bill that's being voted on right now, which is December 8th, 2017, is the tax credit on electrical vehicle purchases. So last year, if you had purchased a Nissan Leaf or a Tesla of any kind, on your tax return, you could have claimed a credit of $7,500 to encourage electrical vehicle purchases. Now, things like that, environmental initiatives, climate change initiatives, renewable energy initiatives, have sparked debate for over a decade now between Republicans and Democrats, and longer than that, really. What's less obvious is that environmental issues have effects on pressuring societies, and these effects cause those societies to often cascade into political crises or political change. Let's look at a real book just for a second. So this is After Tamerlane by John Darwin. One of the recurring themes in geopolitics is that when there's an economic crisis, especially in agrarian societies, food runs short and people suffer. So when the peasants get hungry, they get angry. When the peasants get angry, they revolt. Makes sense. Believe it or not, though, that revolt is a political act. Revolutions may be historical events, but they're also acts of political extremism. And they're brought about because the political change in a given system is required. Well, how does that relate to environmentalism? Directly. This book, After Tamerlane, actually lays out a series of internal revolts in China in the 16th through the 19th centuries. And they largely center around a lack of food, and that's often because of what's called a Malthusian crisis. So there was this cat named Malthus. He basically lays out there's a direct correlation between food production, and so that means it's 1-to-1, so it's just sort of climbs. But population growth, on the other hand, is exponential. Because of that, eventually you're going to have too many people for the amount of food that you can make. When you exceed the amount of food you can make, you have a crash. That's called a Malthusian crisis. A lot of people die, a lot of horrible, not very fun. But in China, this is exacerbated. So in China, you also have deforestation and desertification being created from the deforestation. So people are chopping down trees for fuel. Okay, that makes sense. We do it up here all the time. But when you chop down too many trees and you don't replant them, there's nothing to keep high winds from eroding soil away and creating more desert, which is not very good for farmland. The lack of farmland reduces the amount of food that you have. Topsoil leads to famine. Okay? Topsoil erosion. So topsoil erosion leads to famine. Okay? So famine leads to revolt. Revolt leads to political revolution. So environmental effect leads to political revolution. That's a scary thought, isn't it? Now, another place we can look at is optics, and this is a little bit more esoteric, so just stay with me. This is a place where political science and environmental science sort of cross over. Public opinion these days, I would say, is very much pro-environmental. We see this in the effect that public opinion and media have on foreign relations and internal politics. Excuse me. Think about it this way. This new tax plan had our public opinion sour on it a bit when it emerged that the tax bill included a pathway to greater oil drilling in Alaska. Part of that is the media carrying the information, and part of that is the opinion of vocal members of the population making their political opinions known. Both public opinion and media effect, though, are necessary for any given democratic government to determine the will of the people it's trying to govern. Now, again, Environmental effect achieves political change. What about history? Setting aside the above examples about China, has anyone here ever heard of The Grapes of Wrath? It's a book about the effects of the Dust Bowl on the farming family and the fallout from it, among other hardships. I don't actually have a copy of it, sadly. No, I'm not sorry. I don't like John Steinbeck. But in real life, large numbers of farmers and their families tragically had to move from the regions affected by the Dust Bowl because they just couldn't survive. Very similar to China, you had topsoil erosion and these great walls of dust flying because of high winds. I know this because my mother is from the area where the characters in The Grapes of Wrath end up. They end up in an area around what's called Bakersfield in California. My mother is from Arvin, which is a small town just southeast of it. I need only mention the word Oildale and receive a response from my mother, a very emotional one, about poor farming practices. Why did the Dust Bowl occur? Well, you had poor farming methods, but you also had a massive expansion of farming occurring at the time. You had large areas of just empty land in the Great Plains, and there was a food shortage globally, and so people were expanding out and farming, and they weren't really worried about letting the land lie fallow. And this is something else we learned about in GC 101. If you don't let land lie fallow, it gets degraded. There are a couple of different ways it degrades. Nutrients is the big one. But in this case, by not letting the land lie fallow, by not letting long root tall grass grow the way it had been for thousands of years, you basically make the land very, very susceptible to topsoil erosion, just like in China. Well, now we're going to go on to another book. Kenneth Pomeranz. This is called The Great Divergence. And in this, the author, Kenneth Pomeranz, gives us another example of deforestation. And that's England. We don't often think about England being deforested. We think about, oh, these rolling hills with large sort of forests. But by just before the Industrial Revolution, England had basically been deforested. There was only about 2% of the available land as forest left. And this is because they were using wood, as you can see, for fuel. Cooking, heating, steel making. The problem was they ran out of trees, and so this created societal pressure. That societal pressure led to the Industrial Revolution. Without the Industrial Revolution, there's no America. There's no reason. There's no ability to control an area that large. You don't have flintlock muskets. You don't have cannon. It's just too difficult to heat up that much metal with wood. So what about economics? We've talked about history. We've talked about politics. Economics? I mean, as my classmates will know, I early on was very vocal about the fact that I disagreed with the book that we were reading in GC 101. I'm also very vocal about the fact that everything has a cost. And it's not just environmental, it's everything. This computer has cost. This shirt cost me money. It costs money to have someone chop down the wood because I don't have the time to. So, interestingly, we can immediately go back to Kenneth Pomeranz, Great Divergence, and see about the economic side of this a bit. So that Industrial Revolution we just talked about, it was driven by an environmental pressure to find a new fuel source. That fuel source was coal. Now, there was a lot of external pressure, and it's not just coal, but coal played a very, very specific part of how England was able to avoid Malthusian crisis. This coal allowed for greater steel production. Steel production allowed for the building of empires as technology increased. Bolt-action rifles and railroads and steam engines and stronger ships. And as empires grew, the system of economic trade occurred called mercantilism, or mercantilism, I suppose. But as mercantilism fell away and as empires became less powerful and were forced to sort of work with others for trade purposes, you begin to see the beginnings of modern capitalism. So environmental pressure leads to economic change. And that economic change is created through human change and technological change. Well, what if we add a little politics into the mix? So we're going to go to another book. This is Foreign Policy, Theories, Actors, and Cases. It's a favorite of Professor Kassab's. I'm not a fan of it. I've had quite a bit of dealing with it. But it's a very, very effective tool at talking about certain things. And one of them is economic statecraft. So economic statecraft plays into politics in this manner. I'm a country, let's say I represent the United States, and a given country is not doing something I want it to do. I can use economic sanction or I can use economic benefits to try and get that country to do what I want them to do or stop. With the United States withdrawing from the Paris Accords, there's now the threat of economic sanction by other nations on the American economy. So that's environmental policy leading to economic effect and connecting political science. And who knows, maybe in 10 years, someone will be making a video just like this one saying, wow, it's economic effect, and political science and history all together, all because of environmental policy. Who knows? So how does this all relate to me? Why choose these three disciplines over any of the others? What makes these schools of study so important? Why am I able to speak with them on such force? Well, my major is social studies for secondary education. My minor is political science for secondary education. And what that is just a very long, complex way to say that when I graduate from Northern, I intend to get a job as an educator teaching all three of the disciplines I mentioned: history, political science, economics at the high school level. And ideally, I'd have the same group of students. So I'd have students for world history and U.S. history, and then when they're a senior, for government and econ. Environmental science, as I've shown, is related to all three disciplines. So its effects have to be taken into account in each. And as a teacher of history, I have to be able to recount how human life and culture has changed over time and what drove those changes. And as we saw, part of this is environmental and part of it is human impact on the environment. And, there's other things too, but a lot of human history is affected by the environment and how we've affected it. As teacher of political science, I have to be able to relay methods through which we govern ourselves and our perception of the world. And more, especially with the latter, the perception of our world, environmental science and environmentalism is impacting how we look at things. And it's kind of necessary for us to take that into account now. As a teacher of economics, I have to be prepared to present information on the costs and benefits of human actions and the methods that we use to control monetary interactions between ourselves. And all of that is affected by our environment. Just take gasoline. As oil drilling becomes more difficult, we're going to have more fights over oil. As we have more fights over oil, the cost is going to go up. As the cost goes up, that's going to affect how we govern ourselves. It's going to affect what we do to try and change how we use oil. So, but just give me a second. Humor me here. Let's reduce the level of connection further. Each of these disciplines focuses on us as people and how we go about living. Without the environment, humanity cannot live. We need the air, the water around us. We need to be able to farm. We need to be able to live. But simply by existing in the world, breathing, living, doing the things that we do every day, we change it. And these changes have impacts. Every change we make on the environment, therefore, alters our environment. And this in turn changes how we respond to each other. Let's say there's a famine in the United States, God forbid, and the price of grain, let's say wheat, goes up by 5 times what it is now. You won't be able to make a sandwich. Subway is just going to disappear, or it's going to be a 5-star restaurant in cost. That's going to change how we look at each other, how we look at farmers, how the farmers look at people in cities. So, in conclusion, I'm going to be honest here. I'm a political conservative, socially and economically. But I'm not excused from not knowing environmental science. In point of fact, as an aspiring teacher, GC 101 is a required course. I can't graduate without it, and it's central to my major. And as you can see, there are many ways in which the three disciplines that I prefer to environmental science are connected to environmental science and each other. I'm going to end on this thought. When I started this class, the first week, there was a bit of the reading that I will say annoyed me. It stated that essentially environmental policy had a negligible cost. I disagree. But as I thought about it, I realized that it's not wrong. Not from a certain point of view. As time goes on, climate changes. Efforts to stop that climate from changing are going to become more expensive. And then you extrapolate. You start looking at all of the disciplines that I've mentioned here, history, political science, economics, and you realize that there's a cost to everything. Everything we do, everything we want, everything we like to enjoy, everything that we don't do has a cost. Even when you have the opportunity to do something and you don't, that's considered a cost. It's a cost of lost opportunity. This class has certainly given me a new perspective on the cost of lost opportunity where the environment is concerned. And it is sobering food for thought. So, with that, I'd like to end my video and my semester. Thank you for your time.